Hi, I'm Brian Phillips with the Texas Institute for Property Rights. Welcome to our mini-course, Framing and Property Rights. Discussing political issues with someone else can often be very challenging, and this is particularly true when they're controversial issues. We're often very highly emotional, we're passionate about the issue, and we're certain that our position is correct, and certain the other person has a position that is incorrect. At the same time, they are being passionate about their position, and they're equally certain that they're right and we are wrong. When this occurs, it can be very easy for us to talk past one another. Each of us is more concerned with being right or refuting the other person than being focused on making the best decision. This represents a missed opportunity. When we're talking past one another, we really aren't presenting our views. The other person isn't listening to what we have to say. And at the same time, we're not really focusing on what they're saying and trying to understand their point of view. The opportunity is to shift the thinking of the other person. We engage in these conversations because we want to persuade them. We want to move them closer to our position. But we can't do this if we're talking past one another. These discussions usually start with good intentions. We want to convince others that our position is correct. We want to move them closer to our thinking on the issue. We want to express our views and refute the other person's views. But this can quickly go sideways, particularly when we're very passionate about the issue. When we're passionate, sometimes our voice raises, and that can come across as anger or hostility when it's really passion. But if we're taking the position that we are correct and the other person is wrong, it can be, especially when there's a lot of passion in our voice, our words and our tone can come across as if we're saying that I'm right and you are an idiot. So the conversation quickly becomes a confrontation. Again, we're talking past one another. We're not really engaged in a conversation. We're both just putting out our points and trying to refute the other person. And when this happens, many times tangential issues are raised. It's kind of like whack-a-mole. We address one issue, and then the other person brings up another issue. And we address it, and then they bring up still another issue. And the conversation goes like this, wandering all over the landscape, and we never really resolve anything. And this results in an angry argument. We aren't changing anyone's minds. We're not moving the person closer to our position. All we're doing is engaging in a back and forth, tit for tat, and there's no real exchange of ideas or information. And sadly, when this occurs, we often move the other person further away from our position. They might conclude that we're the one who is the idiot, and if anyone who holds that position is like us, then they just reject that position and they become more entrenched in what they previously believed. The alternative to an angry argument is a constructive conversation. In a constructive conversation, we exchange ideas and information. We're actively engaged in a discussion rather than an argument. We're working with the other person to achieve a common goal or value, or to resolve an issue that we both think is a problem. And this will lead to better decisions. The key to having a constructive conversation is to reframe the discussion. This narrows the focus so that we're discussing one particular issue or aspect of the issue rather than wandering all over the landscape playing whack-a-mole. It can also remove animosity. Instead of us being enemies, we're focused on a common problem or a common value or goal, and we're working together to achieve that value or goal or eliminate that problem. So we can turn enemies into potential allies when we can have a constructive conversation. The framework is the structure of the conversation. If we think about a building, the framework determines everything else about the building. It determines its final shape, what it looks like, and how efficiently it serves its purpose. The same is true of a conversation. If we have the proper framework, then the conversation can proceed in a way that accomplishes our purpose, which is to persuade the other person or to move him closer to our position on an issue. The framework identifies the method that we are going to use for the discussion, and the method is crucial. We are essentially establishing ground rules for the conversation. We're going to say, this is how we will discuss this issue, and this is what we're going to discuss. Ultimately, the framework determines how information is processed. The method determines how the facts and information that we share are analyzed and evaluated. Now, there's three aspects to the framework. The first aspect is the full context, considering the full context. That's kind of the big picture view rather than just some narrow, minor aspect of the issue. The full context includes all of the alternatives. And then we must look at the pros and cons of each alternative. Every alternative will have positives and negatives. No alternative is 100% perfect in that it resolves all issues or accomplishes the desired goal but has no negative aspects. So if we want to make a good decision, then we should look at all of the alternatives as well as the pros and cons of each. We also need to look at the long-term consequences. The policies that are enacted today do have long-term impacts. They're passed on to future generations, so we need to examine what those consequences might be if we want to make a good decision regarding policies today. Now, our purpose in considering the full context is to identify our choices, to have clear choices. And then, when we are clear on what our choices are, we can choose the one that best meets our needs. The second aspect of the framework is to agree to use precise language and to define our terms. Often in political discussions, individuals use cliches and bromides. And these ambiguous terms can mean different things to different people. So if we're attaching one meaning to the term and they attach a different meaning, we're essentially talking about two different things. We have two very different ideas or definitions of what the term means. So we need to agree to be very clear and precise in our language and understand what it is we are actually saying, and the same is true of the other individual. The third aspect of the framework is to identify a shared goal or value, or alternatively, a common problem that we want to eliminate. Our goal is different than the other person, then we're arguing for something very different. If, for example, they want to eliminate all private property and we're trying to address, or we desire to address, one specific issue, we have two very different motivations, two very different ends in mind. But if we can identify a common goal or value, we've turned that enemy into an ally because we're trying to accomplish the same thing. And then the discussion shifts to the best way to achieve that goal or value rather than arguing strategies that may be aimed at different goals and values. Now, we want to make these things explicit because that makes it clearer. It gives us greater clarity on what we're trying to achieve and how we're going to try to achieve it. And clarity leads to better decisions. If we frame the discussion properly, then we will have greater clarity. We're more clear about what it is we want to achieve and how we're going to discuss the issue. And we frame the issue or the discussion properly, we can then combine the knowledge of two people to better identify the alternatives and make a decision regarding which alternative is the best one to choose. When we are discussing political issues, it can be very easy to make assumptions about the other person and their ideas, simply based on their position on a particular issue. And there's two aspects to these assumptions. The first aspect is making assumptions about their motivations or goals. We hear their position on a particular issue. For example, they support a particular land use regulation, and we might assume that they're opposed to all private property, or that they want to abolish all property rights. But this may not be true, and it probably isn't true. It is possible for individuals to come to the wrong conclusion on an issue through an honest error. But if we assume that they have motivations or goals that they actually hold, we're bringing into our evaluation of them and their position a whole host of erroneous ideas. Also, this assumption can go both ways. If we're making assumptions about them, they can just as easily make assumptions about us that aren't correct. So if both parties are making assumptions at the same time and those assumptions are wrong, we're engaged in a conversation that's just filled with false information. The second aspect of assumptions is to assume their position on other issues based on their position on the issue we're discussing. And again, this may or may not be correct, but we don't know. We don't know if it's correct or not. And if we make that assumption, then again, we can be bringing into the conversation a whole litany of erroneous information. So it's better to give them the benefit of the doubt and assume that they don't have these incredibly nefarious motivations or positions on other issues. We should judge them on what they actually say and not what we believe them to believe and think. The framework of property rights discussions is often set by those who would violate property rights. Many times they assert a problem and then propose a solution, and the ensuing discussion centers on that proposal. They defend the proposal and talk about all the good things it will accomplish, and we attack that proposal and point out all of the bad things that it will cause. So that framework of the discussion is set by those who would violate property rights, and that's where the whole discussion centers. And this puts the defenders of property rights on the defensive. Unfortunately, many times we implicitly accept the premises of those who would violate property rights because they're establishing the framework. So we wind up debating the wrong issues because we haven't established the proper framework. Also, without the proper framework, we may have the appearance of having values that differ from the other side, when in fact the opposite may be true. We both may have the same value or seek the same goal, but because of the manner in which the discussion has been framed, it appears otherwise. So if we frame the discussion properly, we can actually shift the discussion. We can make it a constructive conversation rather than an angry argument. And we do this by identifying a common goal or value or the common problem that we want to eliminate, and we agree on a method that is acceptable to both parties. When we do this, we can have a constructive conversation, we can persuade others, and we can reach the best conclusions.